What if I told you that a whole chapter of human history has been hidden from us? Not just a few artifacts or forgotten texts, but an entire civilization systematically erased from the world's records. A civilization that possessed technology we still can't fully explain, and architecture we can barely replicate. We're told it never existed, yet ancient maps, inexplicable ruins, and cities buried beneath our feet tell a completely different story. These traces point to something much larger and more ancient, something we were perhaps never meant to find. Walk through the oldest parts of any major city, and you'll start to notice clues, if you know where to look. Some buildings just don't fit the historical picture we've been painted. Magnificent cathedrals with towers reaching for the sky, adorned with carvings so detailed and complex it's hard to believe they were created without modern tools. Tools we are assured simply didn't exist back then. Star-shaped fortresses sprawling over vast territories, with perfectly symmetrical angles and bastions, as if designed from a bird's-eye view. Domes and towers topped with copper, gleaming in the sun as if they were made to capture an invisible signal. The official history claims all this splendor was erected by people with handsaws, wooden scaffolding, and horse-drawn carts. And somehow, this primitive toolkit was enough to create massive granite columns weighing tens of tons, carve perfect stone arches, and assemble complex metal structures that would be a challenge even for modern factories. But if you look closer, the mystery only deepens. Some of these monumental buildings are covered in strange marks that look like they've been melted. The stone is deformed as if exposed to colossal temperatures. Other structures are half buried in the ground. What was once a grand entrance or a first-floor window is now significantly below modern street level. In some cities, entire floors lie hidden beneath the feet of pedestrians, turned into basements. Why would anyone invest incredible effort into creating such beauty, only for it to be hidden underground from the start? Alternative researchers offer a simple and shocking answer. These buildings weren't built in the way or at the time we're told. They were excavated. They were dug out from under meters of debris from a lost civilization, then restored, cleaned up, and given a new biography, written into a new, rewritten history. We see these architectural masterpieces every day but miss the obvious. Maybe they weren't built, but rather unearthed. But by whom? And after what catastrophe? To understand who left us this grand legacy, we need to look at the evidence from the time when these cities supposedly found their new life. The photographic archives of the late 19th and early 20th centuries are particularly strange and revealing. When we look at these clear black and white images, an astonishing picture emerges. City after city, from America to Europe and Asia, displays an incredible level of development and infrastructure. Wide, perfectly straight avenues paved with cobblestones, lined with massive stone and marble buildings. Majestic opera houses, banks, and administrative buildings adorned with columns, porticos, and sculptures. Manicured parks with elegant fountains and thoughtful layouts. The entire infrastructure looks complete, monumental, and ready for life, as if it had stood there for centuries. Everything is in place, ready for thousands and thousands of inhabitants of a thriving metropolis. Everything, that is, except the inhabitants themselves. This is the main anomaly that catches the eye. Where are the people? In many of these photographs, the cityscapes are strikingly empty, almost ghostly. The widest streets, capable of handling bustling traffic, are completely deserted. In front of grandiose buildings designed for hundreds of employees and visitors, you might see only a few lone figures, whose presence only emphasizes the overall lifelessness. It doesn't look like the quiet of an early morning or a holiday. It looks like an unnatural, staged silence. Even where people are present, their numbers are negligible for cities of this scale. These are not the bustling crowds we would expect to see in the industrial era of rapid urban growth. Sometimes, the only people captured in the photos are workers, but their activities raise even more questions. They aren't laying foundations or raising walls. Instead, they are busy with something completely different. You can see them with shovels and wheelbarrows, digging out the lower floors of already standing buildings, cleaning facades from thick layers of dirt, or clearing away damaged sections and rubble. Their work looks less like construction and more like an archaeological dig or a large-scale cleanup after some cataclysm. One gets the persistent feeling that someone arrived in a ready-made but abandoned and partially buried city and is now gradually bringing it back to life, making it their own. This raises the main question: what happened to the true builders of these magnificent cities? And who are these new settlers who came into a ready-made world to occupy it? These cities look as if they were not built, but inherited. But from whom? The answer may be hidden where you least expect to find it, on old maps created long before the advent of photography. Maps on which a vast and powerful country, now preferably forgotten, stretched across the sites of these empty metropolises. If we turn to the works of European cartographers from the 15th to the 18th century, we find a startling pattern. On map after map, created in different countries and at different times, a huge territory stretching from Eastern Europe across all of Siberia and Central Asia to the borders of China, and, according to some versions, even further, was consistently marked with the same name, Tartary. And this was not just some nameless, unknown land labeled terra incognita. Maps of that time show mountain ranges, mighty rivers, numerous cities, and even clearly defined borders within this territory. Moreover, cartographers divided this giant empire into separate regions with specific names: Muscovite Tartary, Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary. These maps were created by professionals whose accuracy in depicting other regions of the world we still recognize and use today. They meticulously recorded on parchment what they considered to be geographical and political reality. But then, at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries, something inexplicable happens. The name Tartary begins to rapidly disappear. It vanishes not only from geographical maps, but also from encyclopedias, textbooks, and, most importantly, from human memory itself. In just a few decades, a mighty empire that occupied nearly half a continent becomes a blank space, and its lands are divided among neighboring, rapidly growing states. Historians today claim that Tartary was just a conventional and general European term for distant, poorly studied lands inhabited by nomadic tribes. The name, they say, disappeared on its own as Europe expanded its geographical knowledge and refined the details. But this simple explanation raises a number of uncomfortable questions. Why did a term used unchanged for several centuries disappear almost instantly, rather than being gradually replaced by new names? Why were entire regions with their own names and borders, like Independent Tartary, not just renamed or clarified, but wiped clean, as if they never existed? And why do so many old maps show developed infrastructure, roads, cities, fortifications, in these unexplored lands? Exactly where we are told no advanced settled civilization existed. This all looks less like a natural process of geographical refinement and more like a deliberate and conscious removal of a name, along with the memory of the civilization to which it belonged. Erasing a name from a map is one thing, but how do you erase the memory of those who ruled this empire? According to forgotten chronicles and shocking newspaper clippings from that time, the rulers of Tartary were beings we would now classify as myths. And if you look into the archives of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the word myth begins to take on a disturbing reality. Old newspapers from America, Europe, Australia, and Asia are filled with reports of astonishing finds. While excavating ancient mounds, stone tombs, or even clearing out secret chambers under old buildings, workers and researchers repeatedly stumbled upon giant human skeletons. We're not talking about just tall people, but about beings whose height, according to numerous publications, was estimated to be between 2.5 to 3.5 meters. The reports described huge skulls, massive jaws, sometimes even with abnormal double rows of teeth, and bones that were 1.5 to 2 times larger than those of a modern human. Often, these remains were buried with honors, along with weapons or tools of such enormous size that an ordinary person simply couldn't use them. Giant axes, swords, and spearheads, as if made for warriors from legends. The most striking part of this story is not the finds themselves, but what happened to them afterward. In many cases, they were carefully documented, sketched, sometimes even photographed, and then handed over to reputable institutions, capital museums, or scientific institutes like the Smithsonian. It would seem that such artifacts should have become a global sensation, turning our understanding of the past upside down. But the opposite happened. Shortly after being handed over, they simply disappeared, vanished without a trace, dissolving into museum collections and sealed vaults. Official inquiries were met with answers that the finds were lost, misidentified, or turned out to be fakes despite initial detailed reports. In other cases, these unique remains were quietly and unceremoniously reburied, with no public explanation. It seems as if there was an unspoken directive aimed at concealing any physical evidence of the existence of a race of giants. Those who believe in the Tartary theory propose a logical and frightening connection. What if these giants were not just an anatomical anomaly, but the remnants of the indigenous population and ruling elite of that very empire, erased from the maps? Their incredible physical strength provides a simple explanation for how cyclopean structures could have been erected and multi-ton stone blocks processed in a pre-industrial era. If we are convinced that such beings never existed, it becomes much harder for us to believe in the world they once ruled. Erasing them from the physical record became a way to delegitimize the civilization itself. After all, if there are no rulers, there is no empire. But their physical might is only part of the answer. It can explain the scale, but not the complexity and genius of the engineering solutions. The legacy of this civilization speaks not only of strength, but also of knowledge that goes far beyond our understanding of that era. To get closer to this puzzle, we need to return to the architecture, but this time, look at it not as frozen art, but as functioning technology. Across the world, in buildings supposedly erected by different peoples in different eras independently of each other, we see the same mysterious elements over and over again. Tall spires piercing the sky, giant domes, and roofs lavishly covered with copper sheets, as well as complex metal ornaments that look surprisingly like modern antennas. Official historians and architects call all this merely decorative details, characteristic of certain styles, be it Baroque, Classicism, or Empire. But what if this conventional interpretation is just a superficial view, hiding the true, lost purpose of these structures? Let's ask a simple question. Why was copper so often used for these decorations? Yes, it's a beautiful and durable metal, but its main property, known to any engineer, is its excellent electrical conductivity. And if we look at the placement of these copper elements, the hypothesis of simple decoration begins to crumble. They are almost always located at the highest points of buildings, on the tops of domes, at the tips of spires, on the ridges of roofs. Exactly where they should be placed if your goal was to collect or transmit some form of energy from the atmosphere. Moreover, many of these structures are arranged in strict geometric alignment with other similar buildings nearby, forming urban networks. The shape of these metal finials also raises questions. Often, they are not just weather vanes or crosses, but complex structures of spheres, rods, and discs that bear a striking resemblance to resonant devices and antennas designed to work with electromagnetic fields. Some researchers propose a hypothesis that explains all these oddities at once. They believe that these majestic buildings were not just houses, temples, or administrative centers. They were nodes of a global energy grid. This network used the Earth's natural electromagnetic field, so-called atmospheric electricity, for the wireless generation and transmission of vast amounts of energy. The identical architectural solutions we see all over the world, from Europe to Asia and America, ceased to be a mere coincidence or stylistic imitation. It was a single technological standard, a universal blueprint for building power stations. Builders, separated by oceans and continents, used a common principle because they were part of a single, global civilization. Perhaps the knowledge of how to erect these structures survived a catastrophe, but the fundamental understanding of how they worked was lost forever. Only the majestic stone shells remained, but the science that breathed life into them vanished. Imagine such a world for a moment. A global empire of giants, possessing the technology to obtain clean, free, and wireless energy. Cities flooded with light without a single wire. Perhaps transport that moved without burning fuel. It sounds like a true utopia, a civilization that reached the pinnacle of its development. And this makes its sudden disappearance even more incredible and frightening. What could destroy such a powerful and technologically advanced civilization? What force could not just defeat it in a war, but literally wipe it off the face of the Earth, cutting off its global energy system and leaving behind only a multi-meter layer of clay, sand, and debris that covered entire cities? Many researchers believe the answer lies not in war or internal decline, but in a planetary-scale catastrophe known as the Great Mud Flood. According to this theory, about 200 or 300 years ago, a sudden and massive event buried entire cities and regions around the world. This was not a familiar flood of clear water, but a colossal mud flow, a viscous mass of clay, sand, soil, and debris that moved with immense force, burying everything in its path. It is this cataclysm that, in one fell swoop, provides a simple and logical explanation for all the architectural mysteries we see today. It explains why, in ancient cities around the world, the windows of the first floors are below street level and front doors lead straight into the ground. What we now call ground floors or basements, with their full-sized windows and high ceilings, are actually the original first floors of buildings, buried under a layer of catastrophic deposits. In some places, entire city blocks were buried so deep that only the roofs and upper floors were visible above the new ground level. This same theory also sheds light on the mysterious photographs of empty 19th century cities. The few people in the pictures, busy clearing earth from the bases of buildings, no longer seem strange. They weren't building these metropolises from scratch. They were excavating and developing what was left of the old, mud-covered ones. The sparse population of these huge cities also becomes understandable. These were cities that had survived an apocalypse, where life was just beginning to return. The survivors of this catastrophe, or those who came to these lands after it, started a new life literally on top of the old world, laying new roads over buried old ones and using the surviving upper floors of buildings as a foundation for a new society. If such a flood really happened, it could explain how a technologically advanced civilization could disappear almost overnight and its energy grid cease to function. It explains the physical destruction and oblivion. But that was only half of the tragedy. What followed was no less destructive, but it was no longer a natural disaster. The chaos and devastation that reigned after the cataclysm created the perfect conditions for those who wanted not just to rebuild the world, but to reshape it in their own image, forever erasing the memory of the past. The catastrophe was only the first act. What followed was a deliberate and calculated operation to conceal the truth. An era began that is now called the Great Reset. The surviving elites of the old world, or new centers of power that emerged from the ruins, began a methodical process of completely reformatting history and society. Their goal was not just to take the place of the former rulers, but to ensure that no one would ever remember them or their world. The first step was the physical appropriation of the heritage. The excavated cities, cleaned of mud and restored, were declared their own creations. New founding stories were invented for them, new construction dates were assigned, and the right names were written in as architects and builders. The magnificent buildings that survived the flood were given new functions and new biographies to fit a new, artificially created historical timeline. It was a falsification of unprecedented scale, in which the heritage of an entire civilization was simply stolen. However, appropriating the buildings was not enough. It was necessary to destroy any documentary evidence that could refute the new version of the past. A total cleansing of the information field began. Old books, annals, chronicles, and most importantly, geographical maps where Tartary was still marked were purposefully seized and destroyed. Archives were thinned out. Libraries burned in accidental fires, and any artifacts that didn't fit the new picture of the world were declared forgeries or simply vanished without a trace. Simultaneously, a process of controlled rediscovery of technology began. The preserved knowledge and mechanisms of the former civilization were not completely lost. The new rulers couldn't recreate the global energy system, but they could study and gradually introduce its individual elements under the guise of brand new inventions. Thus, the age of steam and electricity, which we know as the Industrial Revolution, was, according to researchers, not a breakthrough by brilliant minds from scratch, but a metered legalization of long-known principles. Technologies that might have once been publicly available and even free were now patented, monopolized, and became a tool of control and enrichment for the new elite. By the beginning of the 20th century, the titanic work of rewriting history was largely complete. Several generations grew up on new textbooks, lived in cities with fabricated histories, and considered technological breakthroughs the greatest achievement of their time. The memory of the former world was almost completely erased, becoming at best vague myths and legends. But throughout Europe and beyond, the main silent witnesses of the past remained. Entire historic city centers whose ancient, monumental architecture still screamed of its true origin and former greatness. These buildings were the last irrefutable proof that could not be hidden in an archive or declared a forgery. To complete the reset and forever bury the secret of the old world, they too had to be destroyed. And soon, the perfect pretext for this appeared, turning into the greatest tragedy of the first half of the century. The global conflicts known to us as the World Wars, especially World War II, were, according to some researchers, the final and most brutal act of destroying the material heritage of Tartary. Under the guise of ideological struggle, geopolitical ambitions, and national interests, another, deeper task was being accomplished: to wipe the last vestiges of the old, pre-flood civilization off the face of the earth. The new technology of warfare, particularly massive carpet bombing, proved to be the ideal tool for this purpose. For the first time in human history, it became possible not just to capture a city, but to completely destroy its physical fabric, turning centuries-old stone chronicles into dust and rubble. Look at what happened. Entire cities that had stood for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years, surviving countless local wars, fires, and changes of rulers, were erased from the face of the earth in a matter of days or even hours. Historic quarters that were true open-air museums were turned into lifeless ruins. Dresden, known as Florence on the Elbe for its incredible Baroque architecture, was almost completely incinerated. The ancient city of Königsberg, a center of science and culture, was reduced to a pile of stones. Warsaw, called the Paris of the North, was methodically razed to the ground. Dozens of other cities across Europe, from Hamburg to Stalingrad, from Coventry to Hiroshima, lost their historic cores. Palaces, cathedrals, monuments, and luxurious public buildings whose grandeur and complexity of execution hinted at entirely different construction technologies disappeared forever. And when the smoke cleared and the era of reconstruction began, the final plan became apparent. The new buildings constructed on the sites of the old masterpieces no longer resembled their predecessors in any way. Instead of elegant stone domes and soaring spires, utilitarian, faceless boxes of concrete, glass, and steel appeared. The new architectural style, functionalism, brutalism, modernism, seemed to deliberately deny any connection to the past, any complexity or decoration. Everything that could visually link the new generation to an ancient, advanced culture was gone. Whether it was planned or not, the result was the same. By the mid-20th century, most of the architectural heritage of the Old World had vanished, replaced by a modern urban landscape devoid of visible links to a mysterious past. If you destroy a building, the physical evidence disappears. If the evidence disappears, people eventually stop asking inconvenient questions. The puzzle of our history was finally taken apart, and its most important and obvious pieces were swept off the table. But what if we look closely at the pieces that still remain? Let's put all these scattered fragments together for a moment. An astonishing picture emerges. All over the world, we find majestic buildings whose true first floors are hidden deep underground. We see old photographs of perfectly built but completely empty cities, which seem not to have been built but excavated. We open old maps and see a vast, powerful empire named Tartary, which at one point simply disappears, as if it never existed. We read old newspaper chronicles filled with reports of giant skeleton discoveries, which then mysteriously vanish from museums. We analyze the architecture and find traces of high technology, hinting at a global wireless energy network. And finally, we see the signs of a global catastrophe, a mud flood, that can explain all these oddities at once, followed by a great reset aimed at hiding the very memory of the former world. Official historians dismiss all this as pseudoscience and conspiracy theory. They insist that for each of these anomalies there is a simple and logical explanation. Buried floors? The result of natural soil subsidence and the accumulation of cultural layers over centuries. Empty cities in photos? The effect of the long exposure times of early cameras or shooting at an early hour. Tartary on maps? Just a generalized geographical label for unexplored lands. Stories of giants? Either newspaper hoaxes or the misidentification of prehistoric animal bones. But can this collection of disparate individual explanations convincingly describe a global pattern that repeats on every continent? Or are all these explanations just a clumsy and disjointed attempt to hide something so grandiose that it's easier to deny it than to try to explain it? We are not claiming that everything happened exactly as this theory suggests. But it asks the main question: why does our world look like a puzzle whose pieces don't match the picture on the box? Whether you believe that Tartary was a real empire, or consider it just a symbol of a huge, forgotten chapter of our shared history, one thing is clear. There are too many gaps in our past, too many names erased, too many streets buried. Too many events are explained by vague references to accidental fires, unfortunate incidents, or simple coincidences. If Tartary existed, even in part, what else is hidden right under our noses? And if it didn't, then why does so much evidence around the world point to the contrary? Perhaps the answer is that history is not a rigid dogma carved in stone. It is a living process, waiting for its explorers. You don't need to be a professor or an archaeologist for this. Sometimes, all it takes is curiosity, a willingness to ask uncomfortable questions, and the courage to look beneath the surface, in the most literal sense. Because maybe the truth never disappeared. Maybe it's just buried, right under the street you walk on every day.